I went from a lower middle class high school to Stanford University from 1963 to 1967 on a combination of scholarships, work study, and great sacrifice by my parents. I got to Stanford because my high school counselor insisted to my parents that my grades and scores dictated that I should get out of Dodge, in this case, Covina, California, and go to a private university. In those days, it was expected that students from Republican families would become liberal Democrats in college. Many of my classmates and two of my religion teachers, Robert McAfee Brown and Michael Novak, as well as the dean of the chapel, B. Davy Napier, were involved in the civil rights and anti-war movements. I maintained my parents' conservative values until I graduated, for to do otherwise would have seemed like betraying their sacrifices. I majored in religion because I was trying to figure out why my baby brother died when I was 13 years old. Graduating during the summer of love, I spent much of the time I was supposed to be learning German, debating values and politics. By the time I began graduate school in religious studies at the end of the summer, I was deeply committed to civil rights, ending poverty, and stopping the Vietnam War. I believe that my new value commitments were called for by the Christian faith of my childhood and my college studies. Though I had been warned by B. Davy Napier not to go to Yale because they don't like women there, I couldn't imagine that they wouldn't like me. After all, I was as smart as any man. At our first meeting, I told my new graduate advisor, Reverard Childs, that I was interested in interpreting the Hebrew Bible using literary methods. "Miss Christ," he said coldly, "then why didn't you go into comparative literature?" My reception by the other faculty was not much better. Whenever I spoke of the things that mattered to me, I was dismissed. Buber and Tillich were poets, not theologians, I was told. The entire faculty supported the war in Vietnam, and none of them seemed to think that civil rights or poverty had anything to do with the study of theology. The faculty spoke about what a man would do when he finished his degree. When I pointed out that I was a woman, they snickered and said that no one expected me to finish my degree, and if I did, of course, a man would need a job more than I would, because he would have a family to support. There was only one other woman in my class, a Roman Catholic sister who did not socialize with the other students. Most of the male students were at least 5 years older than I was. My parents disapproved of my new social and political values. I felt very alone and spent a whole summer crying. The only reason I stayed in graduate school was because the Danforth and Woodrow Wilson fellowships I had been awarded because I did almost nothing but study during my years at Stanford gave me confidence in my intelligence. And like others in my generation, I believed that the times they are a-changing. In the spring of 1969, one of my professors suggested that I meet his wife, a former graduate student in the program who had never finished her dissertation, who was teaching at a local junior college. Violet Lindbeck handed me some articles that were my first introduction to feminism. By the next fall, I was active in the New Haven Women's Liberation Movement and the Yale Women's Alliance, a graduate student action and consciousness raising group that boycotted Maury's, a men's club associated with the university, and put together a feminist guerrilla theater act in which I played the Statue of Liberty. Yeah. Yeah. Then I have to still see my paper. I think I got the role because I was the tallest. In the spring of 1970, some of us invited Rosemary Radford Ruther and Claire Randall to speak at the Divinity School. This invited Judith Plasko and me to invite the other graduate student women, who until that point had shown no interest in feminism, to tea. This gathering... I don't know what's so funny about tea, but never mind. This gathering led to the direct action known as the liberation of the shit room, a sit-in in the Divinity School's only bathroom for men in the library stacks. Sisterhood was indeed powerful. Knowing that other women felt as I did made me understand that I was not crazy. My growing friendship with Judith was life-affirming. We heard each other into speech, read each other's work. That spring, I also met with Marcia, now known as Mara Keller, Virginia Walbott, and Caroline Whitbeck. Keller encouraged us to support a letter she had written inviting the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to investigate Yale for sex discriminations. We founded the Yale Women's Staff, Faculty, and Graduate Association, dedicated to improving the status of all women at Yale, including its large and underpaid secretarial staff. Caroline Whitbeck and I wrote a model affirmative action plan that was later published by Bernice Sandler of the Women's Equity Action League. Eventually, HEW came and found Yale guilty, but the presidents of the 10 top universities convinced Nixon that they should be exempt from censure. I continued to be active in the student protest movement, traveling to Washington, D.C. to attend marches and serving as a marshal in the rally to free Bobby Seale and end racism and the war in Vietnam that followed the closing of the Yale campus in the spring of '71. In all of these social and political activities, my community was formed primarily by other students. I understood my commitment to justice to stem from biblical religion. Religious leaders, including the Berrigans and William Sloane Coffin, were outspoken in the struggles for peace and justice. I had met Coffin in my first year of graduate study through a friend and had learned that he did not consider women's problems at all important. Instead of Yale Chapel, I attended Yale's Roman Catholic folk mass throughout my graduate years. Though I had been baptized Protestant, my father's family were Catholic, and Catholics at Yale shared my class background. The spirit of Vatican II, opening to the world, and love expressed in the sharing of bread, wine, and the kiss of peace, was alive in the folk mass. A priest who had entered graduate studies with me delighted in referring to me as a practicing Catholic. I grew to feel the power of the Catholic Mass in English, particularly in its connections of the cycles of grief and joy to the seasons. In the summer of 1969, I also began a journey of coming to terms with God's relation to the Holocaust, provoked by my reading of Elie Wiesel's The Gates of the Forest. As I worked on my dissertation on Elie Wiesel's stories, I came face to face with the fact that the Catholic Mass that I loved blamed the Jews for the death of Christ. Because I had participated viscerally and bodily in the liturgy of the Mass, I also experienced the unmasking of Christian anti-Semitism in my gut. It made me sick to my stomach. I could no longer joyfully take part in the Easter liturgy, the high point of the religious year. My break with Christianity began here. In the spring of 1971, I was invited to the first conference of women theologians at Alverno College. Being together with some 20 other women who had studied religion and theology was a turning point for me. For the first time in my experience, the question of women and religion was being taken seriously in community. Another woman and I drafted a short paper on the need for female imagery for God, a subject I would later write much about. Sometime during the week, I suggested that we form a feminist group within the American Academy of Religion. At that time, no more than 5 or 10 women attended the AAR meetings. I was urged to call Harry Buck, then executive director of the AAR, to ask for meeting space. Harry responded positively. So I sent out a letter inviting women to come to the AAR meetings. At the hotel where the meetings were held, I was accosted by the executive director of the Society for Values and Religion in Higher Education, who asked me if we were planning on running a woman for president of the AAR. This idea had not occurred to me. But it was a good one. By the time the meetings ended, we had founded the Women's Caucus Religious Studies, inaugurated the Women in Religion Working Group, and elected Christine Downing as the upcoming president of the AAR. Though I was still a graduate student, I was thrust into a kind of limelight at the age of 25. When I left Yale in the summer of 1972, I was already feeling alienated from the Roman Catholic Mass that had been so nourishing to my spirit. I now felt its sexism as deeply as its anti-Semitism. Every time I heard God referred to as Father, Lord, or King, my stomach went into knots. Liberation theology was in the air, but it did not speak to me. For me, the Exodus, the God of Exodus, who cast the Egyptians and their horses into the sea in order to rescue the Hebrew slaves, was a God of war. The faces of dead and dying Vietnamese children were etched in my mind. Though I was feeling alienated from the Christian God, I was drawn to attend a celebration of the ordination of the first women Episcopal priests at Riverside Church in my neighborhood in New York City. When the women walked in singing, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," affirming a military and male God as their savior, I walked out of the church and never walked back. Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father, which was published around that time, provided intellectual justification. At that time, I was up late one night working on my dissertation, writing about Elie Wiesel's anger at God for allowing his chosen people to die in the Holocaust. My own anger came to the forefront. I began to berate God for letting himself be named in man's image, as God of the fathers, as man of war, as king of the universe. How could a loving and powerful God let men beat and rape women, let them kill each other and women and children in war? Why didn't he send a prophet to save us? When my anger was spent, I lay quietly on my bed. In the silence, I heard a voice in myself saying, "In God is a woman like yourself. She shares your suffering." This experience had the force of revelation for me. I knew I would seek the God who was a woman like myself until I found her. Not long afterwards, I heard my questions echoed in Ntozake Shange's incredible play for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. I rejoiced when I heard a black woman as tall as myself rise up and sing, "I found God in myself, and I loved her. I loved her fiercely." When I took a workshop from that unknown woman named Starhawk in the winter of 1975, I found the goddess I was seeking, as close to us as our female bodies, the life force flowing in all that is, energy of birth, death, and renewal, an ethic based in reverence for the deep connections of all people and all beings in the web of life. I was elated to find Starhawk speaking words that expressed my body knowing and the deepest desires of my heart. I naively assumed that my sisters in academia were seeking her as I was. It was a big disappointment to find out that they were not. My sisters were telling me that goddess religion could have no ethics or sense of justice, yet my sense of the injustices created by biblical religion was so strong that it made me unable to participate in the faith of my upbringing. My sisters called the God of Exodus and prophets a liberator, while I could only see him as a warrior. I began to feel as isolated among my academic sisters as I had once felt at Yale. I will not elaborate on this story here, but only mention that it is reflected in the assumption of this conference that the most significant questions in women and religion are raised by women who remain within religious institutions. Yet I suspect that at least half of the women engaged with questions of women and religion in America have been deeply influenced by the non-institutional goddess and women's spirituality movements. Though I felt marginalized by many of my Christian sisters in academia, I gained the strength to speak my truth from other women whose paths were similar to mine, including Starhawk, Merlin Stone, Z. Budapest, Charlene Spretnak, Hallie Austin, and Naomi Goldenberg. Some of them were invited to the conference, but yesterday was their religious holiday. In 1978, I gave a keynote address before a sellout crowd at the conference, The Great Goddess Reemerging in Santa Cruz. In the speech I gave there, Why Women Need the Goddess, I said that the simplest meaning of the goddess symbol is an affirmation of the legitimacy and beneficence of female power. To my great surprise, this essay has been reprinted in scores of collections since then, including a well-known text on critical thinking for freshmen, and has introduced tens of thousands of women and men to the goddess. Diving Deep and Surfacing, published in 1980, has sold more than 50,000 copies and changed women's lives. The anthologies Judith Plasko and I edited together, Woman Spirit Rising and Weaving the Visions, have sold over 150,000 copies and have helped to transform the way women in religion are taught in North America. I am proud of the religious diversity reflected in both collections and of the racial and cultural diversity of the second. As for my own career, my early fame brought me a number of job offers before I finished my dissertation. I taught for 5 years at Columbia University in the city of New York. But as it became known that I was no longer Christian, my opportunities shrank dramatically. While employed in women's studies at San Jose State, I taught several courses for the Pacific School of Religion. When a graduate woman from the institution asked the female dean why I had not been rehired, she was told that the questions I raised about Christianity threatened the faith of some of the students. I did receive tenure and full professor in women's studies at San Jose State, but I was worn out teaching 4 classes each semester, over 150 students, each of my classes an introduction to women's studies, my office hours filled with women telling me personal stories of incest and beating, while others accused me of hating men. In addition, I was writing and speaking an average of 3 times a month. I always thought I would be happy if only I could get to a graduate institution, perhaps a place like Harvard. But when I was a research fellow there in 1986-87, I was disheartened to learn that women who intended to stay on the faculty were afraid to speak out too strongly. The woman who was assigned to respond to my paper at a women's faculty seminar commented that it was a great paper that combined passion with scholarship, but we at Harvard could never be so bold. It was a commentary as damning as any that could have been given by a patriarchal male. Shortly thereafter, a more senior feminist colleague advised me that though I deserved a better job than the one I had, I should not expect one, given the conservatism of the academy. After all, she reminded me, Mary Daly had never been offered a second job, and Rosemary Ruther only one other. So that spring, I resigned my tenured full professorship and moved to Greece. Personally, I have never regretted this decision. I live in one of the most beautiful places in the whole world, and I am involved in the environmental movement to save it. I found a nourishing spiritual path and ways to teach creatively, leading goddess pilgrimage tours and seminars in Crete and Lesbos. I continue to write, and my books continue to sell, which must mean that I'm having some effect on the women in religion movement. However, it worries me that the women's spirituality and goddess movements are marginalized in the academy and in the seminaries. Because of this, women are not able to study goddess religions, ancient and modern, in major graduate institutions. The insights of women who have left institutionalized religion behind are not heard and perhaps feared by those who hold positions of power in the universities and seminaries. Important groups of women in religion in America are not in dialogue with each other. I believe this is a loss for us all. In my forthcoming book, She Who Changes, Reimagining the Divine in the World, I suggest again that women in religion share much that institutional boundaries mask.